That girl dropped out halfway through college. Don't let her touch this $8 million contract. My father said that in front of more than 200 guests at the 25-year anniversary of our family company. Miller and Co. Polite laughter rippled around the table. An $8 million contract lay between champagne glasses. And just like that, I was reduced to 2 words: dropout. No one in that room knew that I was the only one with the authority to make that contract legally binding, or void on the spot. And this is the story of Ava Miller. People believe the past follows you for life. But what happens when that past is told incorrectly? If one day your own father shrinks you in front of a crowd, would you stay silent or make the entire room look again? And I'm Lisa. Before I continue Ava's story, I want to ask where you're listening from. A kitchen in Ohio? A living room in Arizona? Leave a comment, hit like if you've ever been misunderstood, and stay until the end, because that night, I made a decision that could change my entire family. I was standing right beside the signing table when my father said those words. Crystal chandeliers cast light over the oak table, where the contract lay open to the final page. Expensive gray suits leaned forward. A silver-haired man turned to me. "What did you study?" "Engineering," I replied. "Before." Claire let out a soft laugh, loud enough for the table to hear. She quit. Passion doesn't always last. A few polite chuckles followed. I set my champagne glass down slightly harder than necessary. The sharp clink cut through the distant jazz music. The contract lay open in front of me. Page 17. I knew that page well. I had rewritten the protection clause myself. I looked up at my father. "If I'm not allowed to touch the contract," I said slowly, "then who added the personal asset protection clause on page 17? The table went silent. An investor flipped quickly through the pages. Claire stiffened. My father didn't look at me. He took a sip of his drink and said, "You only provided technical support. Don't make a scene." I didn't argue. I pulled the contract toward me, letting my finger rest on the secondary signature line at the bottom. My name was there. Ava Miller. Technical co-guarantor. 3 years ago, I signed another document, one that made this signature mandatory. Without my signature, the $8 million meant nothing. 3 years ago, the landline rang repeatedly in our house. The Riverside project had just been hit with a complaint, a technical error in the construction file. If the insurance company discovered the mismatch, they could deny coverage. The number mentioned in that dark kitchen that night was $3 million. I only overheard it while standing near the staircase. But the next morning, I asked to review the entire technical file. My father didn't refuse, perhaps because he thought I just wanted to learn. And I found it, a small discrepancy in the load specification, enough for insurance to use as an excuse to walk away. I called the company lawyer before my father did. I proposed revising the technical appendix and submitting a supplemental document within 48 hours. We worked through the night. 2 days later, the file was updated. The lawsuit faded. A week later, I filed for a leave of absence from college. I told my roommate I needed time to think. I didn't say how long I planned to stay with the company. At the celebration dinner afterward, I stood on the back porch while inside. My father raised a glass with partners. I heard clearly what he said through the slightly open glass door. "Claire is the only one in this family who understands business." People applauded. I looked down at my student ID in my hand. The plastic edge pressed into my skin. I slipped it back into my coat pocket. If I had walked inside that night and told the truth, the room might have fallen silent, just like tonight. But I didn't walk in. Now, the $8 million contract in front of us wasn't just an opportunity to expand into Dallas. It was a gamble. I had read every line before the party began. The personal guarantee clause was placed in the middle of the document, not obvious, but clear to anyone who knew where to look. If that clause were revised as my father proposed, raising the loan limit, expanding liability, nearly 40% of our family's personal assets would be directly tied to it. That number wasn't just money in an account. It was the house my mother lived in. It was the land out back where my father had planted oak trees for 20 years. My father leaned toward the investment fund representative. We can be a little more flexible. Risk is necessary for growth. I turned the contract toward myself. Risk is necessary. I pushed it back forward, my voice dry, but not the kind that costs us our home. Claire looked at me, irritated and incredulous. You always see the problem before the opportunity. I didn't answer that. I rotated the contract toward the investors, pointing at the clause. If this section is revised under the new proposal, our family's personal assets become direct collateral, not just the company. One man at the table frowned slightly. My father placed his hand on the edge of the table, his tone still calm. You're overreacting. I looked up. We're putting the house my mother lives in on the table. If it were you, would you take the risk to grow the company or protect your family's security? Which would you choose? The jazz music at the far end of the room continued, but our table was completely silent. No one touched their drinks. I could see the shift in a few faces. They began reading more carefully. Claire opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. My father held my gaze longer than usual, his eyes for the first time fixed on me instead of the documents. There are rooms where decisions are made in calm voices, as if risk is only a number on paper. And there are people standing in those rooms, considered weaker, less important, yet holding the one thing that can stop an entire negotiation. My father closed the contract and turned toward the investment fund representative. We'll adjust the clause. I'll make sure everything remains under control. A nod from across the table. A chair shifted softly. The conversation continued as if my opinion had only been a brief interruption. I left the table and stepped into the hallway behind the banquet room. Through the frosted glass, I could still see my father leaning forward, his hand resting on the papers. I pulled out my phone and called the company lawyer. Do we need an additional signature if the guarantee clause is changed? I asked, keeping my voice steady. There was a brief pause on the other end. Yes, you're the technical co-guarantor. If the clause is changed without your signature, the contract isn't legally valid. I leaned back against the wall. What if I don't sign? Then the contract cannot be executed. I looked through the glass again. The suits were still smiling. Glasses were still raised. No one knew the call had just happened. I lowered the phone. For the first time in years, I wasn't standing at the edge of the room. I was at the center of the decision. I pushed the door open and walked back into the banquet hall. The music still played, but our table had shifted into serious discussion. My father leaned toward the fund representative, his voice lower, confident as if everything had already been settled. I didn't sit down. I placed a thin stack of papers on the table beside the original contract. The sound of paper against wood was loud enough for a few heads to turn. This is the guarantee appendix, I said evenly, registered 3 years ago. The silver-haired investor looked at me, then at my father. You're the technical co-guarantor? I nodded. He flipped through a few pages and stopped at the signature section. His expression changed, not polite anymore, but evaluating. My father slowly turned toward me. What are you doing? I didn't answer immediately. I simply rotated the appendix toward them, revealing the bold line. Any revision to the guarantee clause requires agreement from both original signatories. The table fell silent. Dad called me a dropout, I said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. But my signature is what makes this contract legal. Claire slammed her glass down. Ava, you're overdoing it. This is a company celebration. I'm just reading exactly what Dad signed. One investor leaned back in his chair and looked at my father. If the clause is changed without her signature, we can't release funds. The music seemed softer, though it wasn't. No one touched their drinks. My father looked at the appendix, then at me. He didn't argue. He didn't tell me to leave the table. For a few brief seconds, the large hall was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning overhead. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there, under the lights and among expensive suits, with my signature lying in front of them. I looked at my signature, then at my father. All I had to do was say no, and the party would end within minutes. $8 million would become an unfinished story beneath crystal lights. My father spoke slowly. What do you want, Ava? It wasn't an invitation to negotiate. It sounded more like a warning. Claire crossed her arms, her eyes tense. A few investors exchanged quick glances. I could withdraw my signature and end the party within minutes. I had that opportunity in my hands. 3 years of silence flashed through my mind like a short film. The rainy night, the insurance file, the student ID tucked into a drawer. I didn't want to destroy this company. I wanted to be seen in my rightful place within it. I slid the appendix toward my father. I'll sign, I said, my voice clear. But the guarantee clause doesn't change. My father's jaw tightened slightly. Starting today, I continued, the title technical director will be formally written into the contract, and I will be included in every meeting related to technical risk. Claire let out a short laugh. Are you forcing us into this? I didn't look at her. I looked at the investors. You want this contract to be safe. So do I. One of them nodded slowly. That's reasonable. My father looked around the table and realized he was no longer the only one being listened to. He exhaled, very lightly, then said, Fine. We'll add the title. I sat down and picked up the pen. When the ink touched the paper, I signed my name again, not to save a contract, but to put my name in the right place. The room stayed silent, but this time, the silence wasn't aimed at the word dropout. The party ended later than planned. Handshakes lingered, congratulations repeated as if nothing had happened. But when the last guest left, Claire pulled me into a corner near the empty bar. Are you happy now? She asked, her voice low but tight as a wire. You always have to turn everything into a performance. I took off my coat and draped it over the back of a chair. I read the contract. You want to prove you're better than me, don't you? Claire crossed her arms. Always. I looked at her. The light reflected in her eyes, and the usual confidence wasn't there. I just want to be seen correctly, I said, not raising my voice. Claire shook her head. 3 years ago, you dropped out. No one forced you. Don't turn it into some sacrifice. I didn't answer right away. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my old student ID. The plastic edge was worn. I placed it on the table between us. I dropped out because of this company. Claire froze. What do you mean? The Riverside night, the insurance file, $3 million. I didn't retell the details. I just let those words sit between us. She looked at me for a few seconds, then turned away as if trying to rearrange something in her head. Why didn't you say anything? I gave a small shrug. I tried, but no one asked. There was no music anymore, no laughter, only the distant sounds of staff cleaning up. Claire picked up the student ID and stared at my photo from 3 years ago. You think I knew? I shook my head. I don't think anything. I just did my part. She set the card down and didn't say anything else. The distance between us wasn't an explosion. It was like a small crack in glass. No one hears it when it appears, but both of us know it's there. The truth doesn't destroy a family right away. It only changes who gets heard. 3 days after the party, I was sitting in my second-floor office when I heard a soft knock. My father walked in without waiting for an answer. He didn't carry a thick binder like usual, just a thin envelope. He set it on my desk. I recognized the worn corner, an insurance appendix from the Riverside project. "You fixed the file back then?" he asked, his voice not loud, not harsh. I nodded. He pulled out a chair and sat down. First time, in this room, directly across from me. Not at the head of the conference table. Not behind the executive desk, just a chair at the same level. "I didn't know," he said. I looked at him for a few seconds. No investors, no Claire, no clinking glasses. "You didn't know because you never asked." The words came out softer than I expected, but they hung in the air like something heavy. He didn't argue. He didn't stand up and walk out like he usually did. He opened the envelope and pulled out a copy of the file I had edited. My red markings were still there. "The lawyer said if we didn't have this appendix, we would have lost at least $3 million, he said slowly. I didn't respond. I just slid the pen on my desk toward him. A small gesture, but enough to say I wasn't on the outside anymore. He leaned back in the chair. Light from the window fell across his shoulder, revealing the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, ones I rarely noticed. "You should have told me," he said, his voice no longer hard. "I was here," I replied. No one was looking my way. He stayed quiet for a long time. Then he folded the file and placed it on the desk as if it were something that needed to be kept carefully. For the first time, I saw him not rush to a conclusion. He sat there listening, as if what I said was no longer background noise. A week later, the decision was entered into the official record. The title Technical Director appeared on the company website and in the partner announcement. My name sat right below my father's. I had the authority to attend negotiations. My signature counted on every technical appendix. None of that came with applause. It came with a different look in people's eyes. But dinner at home was different. The oak table where we used to argue late into the night now mostly held the sound of forks and knives against plates. Claire talked to Mom more and rarely looked my way. When our eyes met by accident, she'd turn away slightly, like she wasn't ready for another conversation. My father stopped calling me kid. He called me by my name. That small change didn't warm the room immediately, but it was there. Late one night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed in the office. Through the large glass window, Houston stretched under yellow lights. The $8 million contract was filed neatly in the cabinet. I opened my desk drawer and took out my old student ID. I turned it between my fingers for a moment, then set it beside my computer. Then I opened my old school's website and found the section to re-enroll part-time. I filled in the information and clicked Submit when the screen asked for final confirmation. No one stood behind me. I had nothing left to prove. That night, I left the office later than usual. The city was still lit, and I walked out of the building with the feeling that I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval anymore. I didn't hear the word dropout in meetings anymore. When my father introduced me to partners, he said, "This is Ava, our technical director." He didn't add anything afterward, but that change didn't make everything go back to the way it was. Family dinners were still quieter than before. Claire still needed time. Some distances don't disappear just because of a signature. I accepted that. On weeknights, I drove to my part-time classes at my old school. I sat in the middle row, opened my laptop, and took notes like any other student. No one there knew why I had left before. And I didn't need to tell them. I remembered the moment I stood in a room of 200 people, my name on the contract, and I didn't bow my head anymore. I chose to sign. I chose to stay. And I chose to go back to school, not to prove anything to anyone, but to finish what I had left unfinished. The story you just heard is fictional, created with the help of AI and edited by a human to offer a reflective perspective on family, boundaries, and self-worth. It does not encourage anyone to copy any actions in it. If there's one small thing the storyteller wants to leave you with, it's this: the past isn't a permanent label. We are not defined by the moment we leave, but by the way we return. Thank you for staying until the very end. Where are you listening from? A big city or a small town where everyone knows who you used to be? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. If this story touched you in any way, a like or a subscription helps stories like this keep getting told. Having you here matters.